You're all very welcome to this one-day workshop, Deconstructing the Decade of Centenaries, Commemoration and Future Politics. My name is Dr. Jonathan Evershed, and I am the Newman Fellow in Constitutional Futures here at University College Dublin.
Hi, I'm Dr. Rebecca Graff-McRae, and I'm delighted to be here in Dublin, all the way from the University of Alberta in Edmonton, Canada, where I'm a research manager at the Parkland Institute for Progressive Policy.
But we wanted to, at the outset, first of all, before I forget to do so, it behoves me to thank the UCD Decade of Centenaries internal funding scheme for their support for today's event. And we wanted to just kind of frame what it is that we wanted to try and do here today a little bit before we introduce everyone who's going to do the really hard work, which is actually doing that stuff over the course of the day. And we just wanted to talk, I suppose, from our own position as kind of critical scholars of the politics of memory in Ireland about what we mean when we talk about deconstructing the Decade of Centenaries at its end point, looking back on 10 years of commemorative politics, and indeed further than that. And like I say, I want to keep these remarks quite brief, but we'll move to the first panel. But I want to start by saying, I suppose, that the politics of memory are an intrinsic part of the politics of the future. And my current research as the Newman Fellow in Constitutional Futures at UCD is all about political futures on these islands, on the island of Ireland in particular, but right across these islands. And that is very much informed by my work on the politics of memory during the Decade of Centenaries. I've been reflecting a lot recently, for one reason or another, on the kind of intellectual and I suppose professional journey that I've been on as a scholar over the last 10 years. And I remember when I interviewed for a prior role, I was asked on the I hope I'm not breaking any confidences here, asked on the interview panel, someone said, well, you know, your prior work is all about the politics of memory, is that not about the past? To which my answer was, well, absolutely not. Fundamentally not, in fact. It's about the politics of the present, and more intrinsically, it's about the politics of the future, because commemoration is a process of claims making, which seeks precisely to shape the political future, and it interacts with and is an expression of other intrinsically political processes. And the Decade of Centenaries in particular has been an overtly political project, underpinned by policy, by funding frameworks, and by forms of habitus, by forms of behaviour. And it sought to shape discourse and practice on these islands. And to put it very bluntly, looking back over the 10-year period, to put it very bluntly, Sinn Féin, being on the cusp of being in government on both sides of the Irish border, is pretty much the exact opposite of, I think, what was intended by this political project. And this workshop is, I suppose, in that context, an evaluation, or seeks to provide something of an evaluation of the Decade of Centenaries' impact and consequences, and its impact with other political changes that have worked to reshape these islands and the wider world since the decade started in 2012. So I've got a little rundown here, and this is not to say that these things are in and of themselves transformational, but they are, I think, reflective of broader processes of political change into which the Decade of Centenaries has been plugged, against which the Decade of Centenaries has unfolded, and indeed that the Decade of Centenaries is itself influenced. So since 2012, there have been 3 UK general elections, 2 Irish general elections, 3 Northern Ireland Assembly elections, 2 Scottish and Welsh parliamentary elections, 2 UK referendums, both of them seismic and in fact era defining, on Scottish independence in 2014 and EU membership in 2016, 7 referendums in Ireland, including most particularly and importantly on marriage equality in 2015 and on the repeal of the 8th Amendment and the regulation of the termination of pregnancy in 2018. Not that electoral politics is the sum total of politics, of course, but each of these is reflective of and has served to shape wider and very profound processes of political change across these islands. More widely and deeply, the politics of austerity, the rise of the global far right, roads must fall, Black Lives Matter, climate emergency, and of course a global pandemic have all fundamentally reshaped the politics of these islands and their position in the wider world since 2012. In a way that I think our discourse around the Decade of Centenaries, I suppose this is my central claim, basically fails to account for. That in many ways the discourse that has shaped the Decade of Centenaries has remained largely unchanged. And I think that's interesting. And I think that that's one of the things that we want to unpack here today. I could say a lot more about that, but I'm conscious that it's 10 o'clock already. But there is one thing I want to say about, by way of demonstration, and to touch on a theme that we'll delve into much more deeply over the course of today, and that is that of reconciliation. Because commemoration as reconciliation between Britishness and Irishness, unionism and nationalism, has been a kind of central feature of the commentary and discourse around the Decade of Centenaries, that commemoration can be used or leveraged to promote reconciliation, remains this really predominant theme in the discourse around the Decade of Centenaries, despite, in my opinion, having been proved demonstrably false. It doesn't work. It doesn't do that work. And I was rereading Remembering and Forgetting 1916 ahead of today's event, and I want to, I suppose, finish my remarks really by saying that I wouldn't be here were it not for this book, and by stressing how important it has been in shaping my own thinking. I don't want to embarrass Rebecca particularly, but what I found rereading it is that that's all in here. And that was 20 years before the Decade of Centenaries started. It doesn't work. You cannot force reconciliation through shared forms of commemoration, but that's still the insistence within the discourse. And I suppose what I'm trying to say is that it's all here. And that this has been framing of my approach to thinking about the politics of memory on this island over the course of the Decade of Centenaries, and I think it's a set of ideas that we'll be revisiting over the course of today. So I just want to give Rebecca an opportunity to say a few words before we move into the first panel.
Right. Yeah. For the low price of $29.99, you can have the essential handbook on the politics of commemoration per Graff-McRae. He doesn't want to embarrass me, but I am nonplussed nonetheless. So give me a second. I think it's really the point that's sitting with me and has over the last couple of days, while I've been trying to process where we are right now, is what you mentioned, John, about the Decade of Centenaries as this intrinsically political project that's trying to shape a particular political future. And I think when we look back to, not just to 2012, but even a few years earlier as the DOC is being formulated, as it was being put together as an explicit political and official program by the two governments, and how those events were being formulated. I think that the future that was anticipated at that time, the future that was being striven for, I guess, is absolutely not the one that we're in at this moment as the decade comes to its conclusion. And I don't think anyone could have anticipated, as you say, like, also a pandemic. Like, let's throw that in there, right? You know, the meme that was going around a little while ago, like, did we really expect to see, all of, 1918 being played out in this new century, all in the space of a couple of months. So nobody anticipates transformational change when it happens. Nobody's prepared for it, and the best laid plans. But I think there's something really valuable, critically valuable for us as scholars and beyond that, to looking at where is that gap between what was intended or what was being set out as the objectives of the Decade of Centenaries in 2010, 2011, 2012, and how have the intervening years revealed perhaps the impossibility of those objectives that was already there. So that's perhaps my first thought. And the second, I suppose, is just this reflection on the passing of time, you waving my book around and reminding me of how old I am, and the fact of this decade itself is already in its 11th year. It's the decade that never ends. We may just keep tacking years onto the end of it just to keep filling bits in. But I was thinking a lot about a particular story when I was a baby PhD that brought home to me about how we put different events together in a political way. What does it mean to place certain anniversaries or certain historical events into juxtaposition with each other and to call it a package, and how do we critically evaluate that? So I'd only just submitted my PhD thesis about a month prior. This is in 2006. And I was invited to speak at some meeting of European local councillors who were all gathering in Derry, aka Londonderry. And I thought, oh, this is a perfect moment. I'm talking about memory. At that moment, we were in the middle of the 90th anniversary of the Easter Rising, the 90th of the Psalm, and the unfolding commemorations of the 81 hunger strikes were everywhere in Northern Ireland. The people wearing hunger striker GAA jerseys, and it was inescapable to me as someone who's attuned to this. And I thought this is the moment to reflect on how these three events are speaking to each other, or in some cases speaking past each other. And okay, so here's this is my big idea, and I was so excited to present this. And there's a moderately big name scholar who was speaking just before me. And I'm like, okay, this is fine. So he gets up and he starts into his introduction. He's like, I'd like to talk today about these three pivotal events that are all hinging together in this year. And I'm like, oh, bollocks, I've just been scooped. Moderately big name, he's got my big idea. What am I gonna do? Now I have to pivot and I have to come up with something new to say about this. And that was my best line, and that framed my whole talk. Cool. So when he starts talking about this unique coincidence of anniversaries and how significant they were for understanding the relationships between and within communities on this island, and he says, and of course, those events are the Easter Rising, the Battle of the Somme, and the anniversary of the birth of Daniel O'Connell. And I thought, great, I've got something really important to say to that one. And I did. And so I think what we mean by how we put these events together, is fundamentally political. It's shaped by our choices, and it in turn shapes what we think of as possible to talk about. And if you're only looking at the birth of Daniel O'Connell and you're missing the hunger strikes, I think there's a political conversation that's not happening there. So what I hope for today is that part of what those threads that we're pulling on, and I think my daughter in the room here, who's as old as my book, mentioned last night, the idea of unraveling a jumper. We've snagged this piece of yarn and we're going to just keep pulling on it. And so that's what I hope for today, is we're looking for the places where the yarn has snagged and where it's all a little bit too perfect. And we're going to find those important political conversations that are not coming to the forefront. So I place that heavy burden on all of our wonderful speakers for today. And thank you all for being here and being here. And I'm excited to hear how it goes today. Thanks.
Thanks. So we'll move straight into our first panel. If Dom and Siobhan want to come up, and we'll do a bit of musical chairs. And the first panel this morning, looking at themes around commemoration, citizenship. Do you want to go here, Siobhan? And then I'm not the centre of attention, which probably will benefit us all. Commemoration, citizenship, and the politics of maturity. On this panel, we want to explore, I suppose, revisiting what commemoration is, what function it plays in our politics, the politics of commemoration, how that relates to questions about citizenship, and a discourse that has predominated during the Decade of Centenaries, that of maturity. And what do we mean by maturity? Those are, in our approach to commemoration, those are some of the questions we want to try and tackle on this panel. For this panel, I'm delighted to be joined in the room by Dominic Bryan, whose last public appearance went viral for several good reasons, I think. Found speaking truth to power often is our Dominic Bryan, who is Professor in Anthropology in the School of History, Philosophy and Politics at Queen's University Belfast, and also my former PhD supervisor. Siobhan Doyle is a curatorial researcher for the 20th Century History of Ireland galleries at the National Museum of Ireland, Collins Barracks, and has been an assistant lecturer in design history at the Technological University of Dublin. Laura Makatakni, joining us from Denmark, the delegate from Denmark, is an associate professor in the Department of Archaeology and Heritage Studies at Aarhus University. And last but by no means least, Owen Daly is a lecturer in law at NUI Galway. I think it's really excellent, and one of the things that Rebecca and I sought deliberately to do with today's events is to take an interdisciplinary approach to interrogating and indeed deconstructing the Decade of Centenaries. So we're delighted to be joined by colleagues, scholars from across a range of disciplines. So that's enough from me, and I'll hand over in the first instance to Laura, I think, is first on the billing, if that's okay. And we'll go in the order that everyone is listed on the Eventbrite. So over to you, Laura, who's going to frame our discussion for today.
Thank you very much for inviting me to talk today. I'm sorry I can't be with you in person, but hopefully you can hear me through the errant link. So I've just got some kind of brief notes to make on commemoration and some ideas that have been forming through this decade. And they touch on a lot of stuff, obviously, that Jonathan and Rebecca have already referenced, and hopefully tie into what other people will speak about as well. To start with, I'll talk a little bit about my own professional and personal insights into the Decade of Commemorations. It is something I've been involved with due to my research on graffiti of female prisoners from the Civil War in Kilmainham Jail, but also as a scholar of commemoration in terms of how state and non-state actors have chosen to commemorate different events, and how there have been comparison and contrast between the different political jurisdictions. Often there's been an emphasis on what's happening in Dublin, not often taking into account what's happening elsewhere in Ireland, and often the North being excluded from that as well. By virtue of my research focus and the connections to place, I mainly have been observing Dublin and Belfast, because I've also been living in Denmark since 2015. So it's kind of interesting being back and forth for events, but also seeing what's happening, particularly online. And so I was involved in early commemorative events, particularly related to RTE as a state broadcaster, and the big events they held in 2015 was the Road to the Rising, and then it was considered such a success. They had a huge range of events that took place in 2016 as well. I was involved in various academic consultations and public events, from the Royal Irish Academy to events that happened at Lissadell House, regarding how to commemorate both North and South, and simultaneously exploring significant anniversaries such as anniversaries connected into the Good Friday Agreement. I was involved in a contentious anniversary related to hunger strikes with a focus on Thomas Ashe, who died on hunger strike when he was being forced fed in 1917, and how this naturally led to discussions about hunger strikes before and after. Throughout all these events, there's been explicit and implicit political factors that have shaped and enabled them, and it became clear that there was various degrees of acceptable commemoration that would be included within the state, with the threat of not being included in official programmes being used to direct what we commemorate and how we commemorate it. The most obvious example I have is the aforementioned temporary exhibition on the hunger strikes, which I co-curated with colleagues at Kilmainham Jail and University of Ulster and University of Limerick. The contents were derived from research we had all completed in various ways on hunger strikes, with a focus on Thomas Ashe, but also looking at precedent and subsequent hunger strikes. We all agreed it would be strange to create such an exhibition and not reference the most famous hunger strikes for most members of the public, which is the 1980 to 81. But we were put under quite a lot of pressure not to go so close to the present, and particularly not touch on 80 and 81. They were actually fine with other hunger strikes in the 70s. Under the threat of being excluded from state recognition for our exhibition and events. After a lot of discussion and debate, we decided it would be academically fraudulent to allow our original idea to be changed like that. And we continued with our plans to reference the 1980 and 81 hunger strikes. It was only on seeing our exhibition that a last minute approval and ministerial open were approved. I had no personal contacts with anyone involved. A lot of it was kind of whispers and, discussions at other events. And I know that mainly those discussions were through civil servants. I didn't actually have any interactions with politicians. But it was clear that the ability to commemorate difficult past had its limits, despite the fact this was supposed to be kind of a reconsideration of what happened in the past. In comparison, the explicit message from official sources is that commemoration is a time of mature reflection, when we all can look back to the past from our elevated positions in the present and take in whatever lessons that history can tell us about what happened as objective observers. Of course, this is very different from the reality that commemoration is always a political act, and the very acceptance of the need to commemorate, especially at important anniversaries, is always going to be tied into how the events in the past speak to current political situations in the present. For past and present are always going to be entwined in the dialectic that create and reproduce each other. Nowhere was this more clear for me than in the catalysing relationship between contemporary women's movement using iconography and inspiration from many of the politically active women involved in Ireland's independence struggles, who were found in good time to inspire slogans such as Rise and Repel and We Have Feminist Unfinished Business, particularly related to the repeal movement. To present commemoration as natural or springing from some shared common sense logic is not only to deny the explicit political act to commemorate, but also to ignore the nuances of how the commemoration takes place. The symbolic importance of commemoration is integral to how it connects the past and the present. What is commemorated, where, by whom, and when are all key to implicitly claiming that this is what the past was about and that it was worthy of memory. The more high stakes a commemorative event, the more high profile those who take part in it, the more symbolic importance it has. As can be clearly seen by the pressure placed on the President, Michael D. Higgins, to attend the commemoration of the creation of the state of Northern Ireland, which he publicly declined due to his interpretation, what had started as an invitation to a religious service, which was framed as a service of reflection and hope, had in fact become a political statement. It's interesting just how much kind of debate was about that refusal as well, and how much what I would consider gaslighting about how political it was or it wasn't. When one considers directly after the service, the UP leader Doug Beattie called it an important celebration. It's clear that the previously carefully chosen words were not really what was happening. What was said out loud afterwards was really how it was being conceived. And it didn't really reflect the symbolism being loaded onto the event as one that it aimed to sustain and maintain what was the birth of Northern Ireland, more so than what was partition of the island as it was being presented. The main reason that such a commemoration could not be considered a neutral event that demanded maturity is the current political upheavals across the Hiberno-British Isles due to the unravelling of Brexit. Without going into boring, excruciating detail about the many twists and turns that the English desire to leave the EU has taken, there can be no doubt that the most disruption it has caused has been in the north of Ireland. While there are many interpretations as to why the biggest party in Northern Ireland before the recent elections, the DUP, have decided to pursue a hard Brexit approach in the face of a popular referendum that wished to remain, there can be no doubts that it is currently opens the constitutional position of Northern Ireland in ways that could have not been foreseen at the start of the Decade of Commemorations. Put simply, one cannot commemorate the creation of the constitutional state of Northern Ireland in the past without reflecting on how questions have been opened up to its ongoing nature in the present. This situation not only makes any commemoration deeply political, it also makes it deeply divisive. To demand that all must commemorate that act can never be viewed as anything less than a demand to acknowledge the status quo, and that is well beyond the limits of maturity. I will end this short position piece with a quick reference to the problematics of these discussions on commemoration, especially with regard to Northern Ireland being conflated with reconciliation. Given the previous statements I've made on the political nature of the past, and especially how it is understood and remembered in the present, it must be clear that the conflation of these two ideas is not only foolhardy but dangerous. The desire to remember contentious and sectional past has few opportunities to reconciliation, but in the current situation, the emphasis on the connection between the two is not only unwise, it is unreasonable. It is time that we become more open and honest about the political nature of commemoration, and as such, the huge limits inherent in it to be seen as contributing to reconciliation, no matter how mature one wants to appear. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. Yeah. What I propose to do is to take each contribution and then we'll open up for discussion and questions. So, Dom, I'd be delighted to hand over to you, and you've got a clicker for your slides. Yeah.
Right, you see it, the slides are kind of brilliant there. Yes, that's right. Okay. Right. Well, listen, thank you very much, Rebecca and John, for the invite. Now, I took the job in hand here and decided that I would literally do the deconstruction of commemoration. Okay, so I would take an anthropological position of what commemoration is. I would look at in real old style how it functions. So this is a piece of functionalism as well, and only get to the history bit at the end, because the argument I'm sort of going to make is that if commemoration or the social group is a room and commemoration is important in it, history is really just the paint that gets painted on the structures of the room. It's not holding the thing up, it's providing a livable space within which you exist. So that's what I'm going to try and do. So I'm going to start by suggesting that we've got to look at how social groups work and how they are bonded together by a sort of ideological understandings. That bonding, of course, and those social groups have become more complex as society has evolved. So if we go back to certain sorts of societies or look at certain sort of societies, it's quite a relatively simple job to see how the ideological construction of groupiness works. But in the modern world, it's quite a complicated thing. And the dominant groups, of which the nation is clearly one, takes an awful lot of gluing together. And I'm going to place commemoration in the space of doing that gluing. The key bonding of groups the key to bonding of groups is to understand not the group itself, but who's in the group and who's outside the group. And when I say who's in the group, and this of course is important as well, I mean the spirits and the ancestors as well. Because like all societies, we seem to define our group with those who are in the past as well as who are in the present. Commemoration, of course, is a vehicle presently based that tries to include those who are in the past. And as John says, and I think this is very important, that relationship is perceived as a relationship of debt. All right, every person's sense of self is embedded in a set of relationships, and these include the relationships of the past. So one's sense of self is connected to that social relationship with the past. These social relationships are the weft and the weave of politics. Okay, the relationships of power exist in a set of narratives, And what I want to try and do is understand some of those narratives. We know the narratives very well. We know that they are part of a social construction, and in that social construction we can put categories like gender, nation, race, age, ethnicity. They're all social constructions. That's the position that I'm taking here. And the social relationships are structured and embedded in those narratives. Hopefully, when I come back in a moment to look at some of these things, that will all make a bit of sense. But we can see common discourses that run right the way throughout them. So, for instance, I'll come to in a minute, the discourses of family and lineage and belonging. We all know nations use things like fatherland, motherland, and as I'll talk about at the moment, lots of commemoration involves a relationship with the familial. You know, did one have a relation who died or who was there, or does one's name connect with the past? There's a lot more culturally going on here, and as I'll come to the end, I'm sort of thanking Marshall Salins for suggesting that history only works when embedded in can only be understood as embedded within culture. So let's start. So we start by thinking about what makes these social groups tick, and then we're going to say, well, how does commemoration work within those social groups? So as part of how it all works, the bit that's interested me over the years, and this isn't the only bit, but this is the bit I'm going to start with, is how the ideas that we have are structured through lots of symbols and rituals. And I think it doesn't need saying anymore how important ritual occasions and the symbols that are the language of those rituals become in people's life. They are structured through repetition, so we sort of know what a commemoration does. All right, so we're not coming to it fresh. The Decade of Centenaries wasn't something new. It was done in a very regular and routinized way, which everybody knew how it was going to work. It utilizes ideas of tradition and heritage, that this social construction of what our past is. Many rituals, and commemoration is obviously one example, exist around an idea of continuity, that this somehow links us with the past, and I'm going to also suggest that continuity is a deeply problematic idea. Ritual events are also designed to be special and often, but not always, emotional. Here is where we find the role of symbols working, that not only provide a text for the ritual, they also provide an emotional connection. In combination, ritual and symbol provide a way that the sense of self, the individual, this is where the group is connecting with the individual, is connected to the idea of group. Interestingly, and here's maybe a problem with the model of social memory that gets used, the idea of memory sort of does the same. It sort of mixes up and says, if we've got memories, it connects us with the past. And I've for some years now been struggling and wondering whether the whole idea of social memory is also problematic. All right. So what happens? What's my next sort of part of this model of what commemoration is? Well, I'm throwing in the sacred. All right. One of the key aspects of the process of the social construction is the idea of the sacred. The ideas are so powerful, they are almost beyond resistance, and that's what makes commemoration so special. When you question these things, and I'll come up to examples in a minute, much has been written on the nature of the sacred, which I do not need to repeat here, but we can see that commemorative practice often works with a good dose of the sacred thrown in. Look at something like, let me try and think of an example, look at something like memorials that are being built technically illegally in Belfast by loyalists and Republicans in spaces, they've got no planning permission, and yet so powerful are those spaces in a way, the state isn't going to intervene, the state isn't going to pull them down. It hasn't yet, to the best of my knowledge, pulled any memorial down. So there's something that goes on. I don't even want to start to think about watching pictures from Palestine and the intervention by Israeli forces in that funeral, which I think is made more extraordinary because very often the state even won't go in there. Lots of history of funerals in Belfast which tell that story of the tension, that a funeral almost makes a place that even the state won't touch. The discourses of the sacred are so, I can't get over this. There was an episode of Question Time on the BBC, and they were discussing the poppy, all right? And the interesting thing about the sacred is that people often think that it's therefore non-political, all right? It sits down, and Dimbleby asked, there was an argument about it, and Dimbleby asked the audience and the people on the panel, do any of you think that the poppy is political? Not one hand went up. Unbelievably, there wasn't a single person in the room who thought the poppy was political, all right? A symbol used to remember those people that died for their nation in the war. What could be more political? I mean, it's difficult to actually think of something which is more political than a war, a person deciding to go and fight for their country, and somehow remembering it is non-political. The idea, it becomes so sacred that it pushes out the notion that it's political. All right. In fact, I suspect people often think that sacred space is polluted by the political, okay? That's why they get so upset when you say, listen, it is a political symbol, folks. All right, so my next idea that's part of this is the idea of lineage and familiars and families. Another strong element in discourses around commemoration is the idea of lineage or family and links, and this has been all over the decade of centenaries. You know, if you can find somebody who was a family member of it, let's get them on the radio and the TV, because they're bound to be really, know what's going on. They're bound to have an emotional connection. So we better get a family member on as quickly as we bloody well can. Almost to the exclusion of kicking the historians out, which is interesting. Narratives around the participation of relatives in battles or wars or revolutions are most ever present in the vehicles of commemoration. On the media, the way graves are used and funerals are used. By linking with a family member, you create the idea that the war battle or whatever is fought for us because they're now one of us. They're in this social group. It legitimates the nature of the conflict, particularly when ideas of sacrifice are added. Ideas of family and a lineage are, of course, themselves socially constructed. Okay, so that's my next bit. Let's go on to loss, debt, and sacrifice. Okay, because this is essential in the commemorative relationship. It tends to be tenuous, yet powerful idea that there is a debt owed to those that died in the past. And by the way, this is what the politicians use. The politicians come on because they are going to use that debt to gain your loyalty. That's the key to how it works. There is a huge amount of anthropological literature on debt that seeks to understand how social relationships are made and sustained through various forms of reciprocity. So amongst all of our, just checking on my time.
2 or 3 minutes?
2 or 3 minutes, right, I'm going to race through it then.
Yeah.
So this idea that people died for us. So what's the next bit of the model? All right, all of this will be fairly familiar to you. The next bit is the sense of self, how one's own identity and belonging is linked through the idea of commemoration, through the idea but because then you can make the history that you're being given familiar in a way that you sort of own the history. I can't believe how often in Northern Ireland I'm told that people need to know their history as if it's owned by them or belonged by them. So when you've got that sense of self, that sense of linking to the history, like bloody hell, I wish my kids would. Somehow in English history, when Harold got an arrow in the eye, that's supposed to be the amount of times our kids get taught about Harold getting a bloody arrow in the eye is unbelievable. All right. So around that, you have a symbolic landscape. Okay, and again, I'm not going to go into all of this because you all are very familiar with that landscape, and that landscape can be both set up by the state, but also by people, by other groups. Okay, and connected to the landscape is the calendar. All right, there's a timing to all of this. It's got to exist in time and out of time. In time, and it happens in the routine form. Out of time because it links us with the past in some sort of magical way. It makes us feel like we're there. Easter Sunday, Remembrance Day, the 12th of July. We know how these days work, along with the idea, here's where the debt comes in, that we must never forget. All based on that very dubious idea that learning the past is going to help us not make mistakes in the future, which I think, as we can say, is a very dubious idea, but also trapped. Now, that is trapped within a notion of heritage and tradition, which is culturally embedded in our societies as something important about how we are. And all of that gives you cultural capital. So all of that, once that's embedded in who you are, and all of that space, and all of that place, and all of that calendar, it's cultural capital. And here's, of course, where our politicians step in, because what politicians do all the time is they use that cultural capital for their own gain, whether you're the Queen of England, or whether you're the President of the United States, or whether you're a leading politician at Taoiseach, that's the cultural capital that you end up using. And commemoration is full of the sacred, and that seems like it's non-political. So then you can make yourself seem like you're not political and yet powerful. All right, so the political, all right, so all of this. Now, of course, there's plenty of resistance to that, so I'm not saying that this is a one-way street. There's plenty of resistance, and you can see, and I was very interested, should have got a picture of how the statue of Margaret Thatcher has gone up and is being egged. Somebody's selling eggs outside the statue to throw. Right, so just to finish with, this is where history comes in. So what is history doing? History is the authorising discourse. History is the language that we use to link all of this together. It surrounds commemoration, all right? It's the story we tell that links it all together, and we're told it's our history, all right? Remember, that is a social construction. So once you've got that history doing that work, and it appears everywhere, it's on drama, it's on TV, it's in the schools, it's everywhere, it sort of smothers us. All right, this idea that we have a particular history. I love that. Recently, The Last Kingdom, the Vikings, The Last Kingdom, the BBC, The Last Kingdom, England is born. I mean, it's, you know, what? All right, but it's very powerful stuff. And as part of that, historians are the figures of authority, okay? So the argument I've made time and time again is historians are not the same as other disciplines in the way this works, because historians are embedded in the authoritative narrative. Does that mean they can't be critical? No, obviously. Does that mean they can't teach yourself? No, things. No, obviously. Does that mean we don't want to hear from them? No, obviously it doesn't. But does it mean that historians have to realise they play a different role in all of this than others, all right, than other disciplines? And then finally, I'm obviously not saying this one-way traffic. This is a negotiated space. There's contestation, there's resistance, all right? What I mainly want to say is it all exists within a cultural body which you can't remove out of. You've got to understand the culture in which that history is embedded and how it works. And I'll finish off with the last idea and a question. I've always wondered whether history plays a greater role in Irish politics and in relationships in Ireland than it does as a discipline, as an idea in other countries. I'm not sure whether that's right, but I throw that out as a question.
Something for us to unpack. Thank you very much, Don. Yeah, and a lot for us to pick up on there when we come to the discussion and Q&A. But I'll move straight over to Owen, who's joining us from Galway, who will talk to the issue of maturity and the idea of maturity in the construction of Irish citizenship during the Decade of Centenaries.
Great. Thanks, Jonathan. Thanks, Jonathan and Rebecca, for organising and indeed for facilitating remote attendance. I had no idea how unsettling it was going to be to see one's face projected on a screen remotely. Anyway, I feel like a bit of an interloper here amongst historians and anthropologists. My background is in constitutional law, and my research is in political theory and constitutional law. And indeed, it's very difficult to compete with anthropologists when it comes to slides, especially in terms of images. I feel like a text-focused square, unfortunately. Anyway, so the point of my presentation is to try to link the discourse of maturity to what I would call the shifting constitutional identity of the decade. The decade of commemoration, if you like, but really the post-recession or the post-bailout decade of the 2010s. Roughly speaking, the decade following the formal exit from the Troika program, 2013-14-ish to the present, which happens to coincide almost perfectly with the formal timeframe of the Decade of Commemoration itself. Okay, and I'm going to argue that there's a distinctive constitutional politics of the 2010s, within which we can locate this discourse of maturity in commemoration. Okay, so could I have the next slide? The next slide, please, Alan. Thanks. The first thing I want to look at is what maturity in commemoration actually means at face value. I've done some analysis here of speeches, of interventions by various grandees, politicians, diplomats, academics, historians about the maturity of the 2016 centenary commemorations. Sometimes that's congratulatory discourse in some ways. And on the surface, I would say the way maturity is portrayed, what it actually means, is a kind of an interpretive pluralism. Okay, so if you look at these various interventions, these various speeches, and so on. Okay, one of these is a tweet. No, it isn't. Sorry, I have the various references for anyone who's interested. You see reference to plurality of views. There is maturity in commemoration in 2016 because of an acceptance of a plurality of interpretations about the event itself. Okay, and this either implicitly or explicitly is usually juxtaposed with the 50th anniversary in 1966 and what's supposed to be a more triumphalist, a more rash, a more singular or bellicose interpretation, a nationalist interpretation of the Rising. So we see here reference to a diversity of views, critical views about the Rising, respect for various approaches. What kind of approaches are meant here? Presumably, whether explicitly or implicitly, it's often meant that we're acknowledging or we're accepting negative interpretations of the Rising itself, such as the commonplace idea that it was undemocratic or violent or whatever. Okay. And here also we see, I think, probably the habitus of the liberal intellectual, the embrace of nuance and complexity, with reference to or distinguished from the singularity or the passion, if you like, of the traditional nationalist perspective on the revolutionary decade. Okay, so that's fair enough. It is what it is. I think on the surface, that's what maturity meant for most grandees. Okay, and the maturity that is being celebrated is their own maturity, the maturity of the formal events, but also very often the maturity of the general population in their participation in these events. But if we move to the next slide, please, Alan. Thanks. I would argue that maturity is, if you dig slightly deeper than that, maturity is understood as what I would call an externalization of constituent violence. Okay, so immaturity in commemoration is understood as something like an embrace or internalization of the revolutionary ideas and of the revolution itself. Okay, whereas maturity involves something like the adoption of a dispassionate stance towards the events being commemorated, and particularly towards constituent violence. Okay, and so here we see really, I think, a projection of the habitus of the professional historian. For the ordinary citizen or participant to be mature means to adopt something like the academic dispassionate stance, and maybe even the stance of the professional historian. And here we see, I think, class habitus and academic habitus really playing an important role. Its maturity is about taking a distance from the events themselves. We see that in various ministerial speeches, ministerial statements, the idea of recognizing the commemorations as a constructed process. The statement here from Leo Varadkar was actually a response to criticisms of the originally planned commemoration of the RIC, which was, I think, in 2020, if I remember correctly. And he distinguished commemoration and celebration. The commemorating the RIC was not celebrating it, but I think implicitly that's extended to commemoration of the Rising itself, and that the overarching narrative here is that commemoration is not and should not be at least purely celebration, that it involves maturity, involves a certain dispassionate stance. It certainly doesn't involve what it's contrasted with is the internalization of or identification with the cause of the revolutionaries themselves. That is not only, I suppose, partisan, but it's actually immature. Okay, to embrace to in a sense internalize the cause of the revolutionaries is immaturity. So make of that what you will. And if we move on to the next slide, please, Alan. I think it's interesting then to try to situate this maturity discourse in post-bailout politics. And there's a number of interpretations we can make of this. Okay, I mentioned habitus a lot already, and that's often a very easy, maybe lazy thing to do. It's about academics or historians or whoever, or various grandees projecting their own experiences and sensibilities onto this issue, and exhorting, if you like, whether consciously or subconsciously, exhorting lay people to follow their example. But Mike Cronin makes the very interesting argument that this maturity discourse around 2016 is part of a particular political imperative at that juncture in the post-bailout years, and it's about, if you like, embracing sovereignty anew and linking the commemoration of independence with the imperative of regaining sovereignty following the Troika bailout program. Okay, as he puts it here, it was linked to the Irish Republic having regained economic sovereignty from the Troika in 2014, and that's why, in a sense, that explains the counterintuitive embrace by a Fine Gael Labour government, particularly of 1916 itself, as the highlight, as the centrepiece of the revolutionary decades. The most, if you like, the most anti-constitutional or non-constitutional episode of the revolutionary decade to be foregrounded as the centrepiece of the commemorative decade. He argues that is explained by the need for a renewed focus on sovereignty in the post-bailout years. I go along with that to a large extent. I think that's quite compelling to a large extent. But I think if we move to the next slide, please, Alan, it's also interesting to link the discourse of maturity to the constitutional politics of the southern state in the 2010s, in the post-bailout decade. One of my main research interests is in constitutional referendums, the theory, the practice of constitutional referendums, and through an analysis of the 5 referendums in particular held over this decade, 5 constitutional amendment referendums, we can isolate certain themes in the shifting constitutional politics of this time. Now, by I mean constitutional politics here in the broad sense. Here I'm referring to some extent to the formal processes of textual constitutional amendment, which is what referendums are for on the surface of things. but also constitutional in a much wider holistic sense as well. Okay, so something distinctive happens to referendum politics after the bailout. Okay, something distinctive happened in the practice, in the use of referendums in the southern states. Okay, we are no strangers to using referendums for social issues, which would be in a way that would be quite unusual elsewhere. Obviously, there's a long history of referendums on things like abortion and divorce and so on. But the post-recession decade saw a series of 5 referendums held on social issues, 5 liberalising referendums, constitutional referendums in the decade, children's rights in 2012, marriage equality in 2015, repeal of the 8th Amendment in 2018, and then 2 lesser-known referendums that I think everybody forgot about if they ever noticed. The referendum on blasphemy in 2018, a little harmless bit of colour if you like, and the referendum on liberalising access to divorce in 2019. I think probably the least noticed of these 5. Okay, so there are a number of things there are a number of features of constitutional politics in the 2010s revealed in these referendums. Okay, the first thing I would say about these 5 referendums is that they were interpreted. The results of these referendums were interpreted not merely as majoritarian exercises with a demographic shift towards a liberal majority on issues like same-sex marriage or abortion. They were interpreted as identity shifting in a qualitative sense. So interestingly, say the results of the 2018 repeal referendum were numerically the perfect reverse of the original 8th Amendment itself in 1983, where you originally had a 2-to-1 anti-abortion majority, which reversed almost perfectly in 2018. And that was portrayed in academic and media commentary, not just as a demographic eclipse of the liberal versus conservative camp, but as a qualitative shift in identity. Okay, a consensus answer. So 2/3 became a consensus. It referred to the many sources, many media and academic sources and political sources refers to a new order, the collapse of an old order, the emergence of a new identity. Now, why is this the case? Well, there are various possible reasons, but one is to do with the deliberative mechanisms and in particular the citizens' assembly process by which some of these constitutional amendments were initially recommended and brought to the people. Okay, the next thing, next slide please. The next thing that I would say about these referendums is that they were understood as having an expressive as much as a legislative purpose. Okay, so the purpose of these referendums was not only to change the law, not only to change what the Constitution said about the relevant issues, but they were conducted in order to make a statement about who we are. Okay, they were understood as instruments of collective self-expression, at least orchestrated instruments of collective self-expression. Okay, and the thing is that obviously some of these referendums did make materially important changes in the law, existentially important changes in the law when it comes to things like the 8th Amendment, for example. At least 2 of these 5 referendums did not. Okay, the blasphemy referendum basically removed an offence of blasphemy, which it was impossible to prosecute, and the children's rights referendum was a slightly hypocritical exercise in making a statement that didn't really, making a gesture that didn't actually make any difference to children's rights on the ground. So they were largely about self-expression, about the articulation of a new national identity. Elite orchestrated instruments of self-expression. Even those referendums that did have a significant material change in the law involved were actually very often framed and understood about, as making a statement about who we are. So in particular, the marriage equality referendum was understood as the Taoiseach then put it, as disclosing us as a generous, compassionate, bold and joyful people. And repeal was making a statement about who we are, and making a statement distancing us from our past. And removing the blasphemy provision from the Constitution was, to some extent, about liberalising and secularising the Constitution in what was actually a very liberalising and secularising decade. But it was also about branding. It was also about, making a statement to the world about who we are, a progressive, modern people, again, with the other, if you like, being the nationalisms of the past, in particular, the religiously inflected nationalisms of the past. And if we could move then to the next slide, please, Alan. So the purpose of these referendums was at least as much, if not more, to disclose an identity as it was to actually change the law. But of course, identity usually has some other in relation to which it's defined, and the illiberal other in relation to which this new socially liberal identity was being articulated was both at the past, our own past, our religious nationalist past, but also the foreign illiberal other. A very frequent discursive reference being to our maturity, again, in terms of us resisting illiberal populism and us doing so much better than the benighted populists on the continent and in Brexit Britain. And then, if you like, really, it's about giving us a rebrand. If you switch to the next slide, please, Alan. So really, these formal constitutional processes, on the surface, constitutional referendums being a formal mechanism for changing a legal text, become, I suppose, a strategy for national branding, where I guess our stock in the world, if you like, our image is refashioned along these lines, which I suppose borrow the discursive tropes of neoliberalism in particular. We see reference to our boldness, our agility, our openness, and so on. Okay, so even popular movements to say improve rights, to enhance access to allow access to abortion, or to improve marriage rights, they're narrated at the elite level in terms of the improvement of the state's image as a place that is agile, bold, open, and conducive to capital ultimately. That is really the constitutional politics, if you like, or one interpretation of the constitutional politics in the post-recessionary decades. Okay, and all of this ties into the idea of us being the best little country in the world in which to do business, as Enda Kenny famously put it. So just to conclude then, and I don't even know if I'm out of time, but I'm concluding anyway, the idea I had originally hoped to talk about was the idea of constituent power, but I didn't. I don't know why. It was too hard. And constituent power, I guess, in political theory and in constitutional theory, is usually understood as the slightly mythical, the extra constitutional force or capacity that founds and sustains the formal political order. Okay, various things can be identified as constituent power, anything that makes or remakes the political order anew. Sometimes at official levels, electoralism is the constituent power, something like a constituent assembly or a plebiscite. I'm not a big fan of that. I think it's a very sanitized, juridified version of constituent power. More often, or a less sanitized version of constituent power, is violence itself, political violence. Okay, political violence is one expression of constituent power in that it makes or remakes a polity. So the 1916 Rising is constituent power. Okay, it's one face of constituent power, a slightly suspect, dangerous, risque expression of constituent power for most sensibilities, I guess. And I refer here to Catherine Frost's very compelling piece recently about what she calls the poetic prophecy of the 1916 proclamation itself.
And she argues that a distinctive thing about the 1916 proclamation as a revolutionary text is that it doesn't claim to speak on behalf of the people, but rather speak to them and to exhort them poetically into the future. And she argues that the nature of poetry in political speech is such as to share the conceptual burden across generations. Okay, the task of interpretation is, if you like, delayed or projected onto the future, and allows for reinterpretation by future generations. Amongst other things, she argues, that gets around the logical paradoxes of political founding, in which usually an elite cadre, in any situation, not just 1916, claims to speak for a people that is founded by the very acts of the elite vanguard themselves. That is something, she argues, which is overcome. It's a contradiction which is dissolved by the poetic nature of the proclamation itself. Well, an alternative argument I want to make is that, building on Dominic's presentation, we can understand ritual commemoration as being itself an alternative face or expression of constituent power. Many scholars, including Negri, for example, argue that constituent power isn't a temporarily finite act that ends with the revolution or the whatever, or the coup or the founding. It is something that is live within the existence of a political community. And he understands that in a revolutionary sense, the power of the multitude. We can also, however, understand constituent power as having conservative expressions. And I would like to understand, this is a theme I'd like to explore, I'd like to understand ritual commemoration as an alternative and conservative dimension or a manifestation of constituent power, in that it seeks to reconceptualize the terms of political belonging in a ritual and discursive forms. And that was my original idea for the paper, to look at political violence on the one hand and ritual commemoration on the other as alternative manifestations of constituent power, which was the thing I couldn't do. So I'm going to just allude to that now. Thanks anyway for listening, and I look forward to the discussion at the end.
Thanks, Ian. Thanks, Owen, and I think a really important reflection on the ways in which commemorative discourses and practices interact with wider processes of state and nation making on these islands, and what's at stake in claims about maturity in those processes, which is a claim that does come back and back and back through the duration of the Decade of Centenaries. Most recently, perhaps, in light of the Armagh episode, what we call it, and something to unpack there. I'm going to say at this stage that this session is liable to overrun, both for our online audience and for the audience in the room. So we'll make adjustments accordingly, but I'm keen to allow a good amount of time at the end of this discussion for questions and answers and discussion. But finally, last but no means least, Siobhan, who will talk to how these questions of maturity, of reconciliation, are reflected in certain kinds of have been reflected in commemorative and memorial practices over the duration of the decade.
Yes, thanks a million, Jonathan. And I'm going to be discussing a case study that's familiar to many of us, the necrology wall in Graff-McRae Cemetery, which was designed, put in place, vandalised and abandoned, or as Glasnevin Trust branded it, discontinued. Now, depending on historical knowledge, cultural background and sensitivity to the subjects represented on the wall, there may be many different readings and reactions to the necrology wall in Glasnevin Cemetery. Now, I come to this interpretation as somebody that has worked in Glasnevin Cemetery Museum, as somebody that lives nearby. So I am a regular visitor, and I don't think I ever saw the necrology wall in the same way twice. So between things being covered up, new names being added to the wall, to me the necrology wall was constantly in a state of flux. So yeah, that's how I've come to the interpretation of it. also from my own research in how death is represented in public spaces. So what I'm going to present today is a visual analysis of the wall itself. Now, the necrology wall claimed to extend the boundaries of commemoration, but as I will argue here, it instead limited it through its very design. Now, the wall itself is a simple design of black granite walls with gold lettering, and the names of men and women who died between 1916 and 1923 were to be inscribed on the wall in chronological order by date of casualty. Each name, and whether they were civilian or military personnel, was to be added bit by bit in line with the Decade of Centenaries. And this, I believe, was an intentionally drawn out commemorative gesture in order to extend the design process, increase publicity, and to encourage repeat visits. So the first limitation of the wall I want to point towards was the timeline. So by confining the names to those who died during those 8 years between 1916 and 23, the wall failed to acknowledge the wider impact of the conflict beyond those years, and also those who survived, who were bereaved, and who suffered in many ways that did not result in death. We must remember that not everyone dies a heroic death during conflict. Many died of injuries beyond 1923 as well. Declan O'Doherty, a PhD researcher in Queen's University Belfast, is examining post-traumatic stress in the post-revolutionary period, and his work underlines how we must acknowledge those that survived, those that endured and contended with the massive psychological impact of those years. The necrology wall leaves no space for those who didn't die during those 8 years, and it also has a tendency towards the death positivity bias. So this is a perception that the deceased are significantly more likeable, more competent and inspiring than their equivalent living targets. The next limitation I want to point towards is the uniformity created by the limited information on the wall itself. So in referring to the victims by name and civilian or military affiliation only, the memorial wall attributed supposedly an equal status to all those killed, something which many visitors and commentators refute. By arranging the names chronologically, the exhibit arguably presented all those who died as victims. The combination of these names on the wall tends to cancel out their individuality, and instead it also cancels out the multitude of voices. It instead gives back to the visitor only one face and one generic voice. Through the cancellation of their images and personal life stories, only the endless horror of the past remains, as if it all happened without any individualised apportionment of responsibility. So what does it mean to read a name? On one hand, it signals the life of an individual. On the other hand, it is a shallow evocation of their presence. The need to bring photographs, flowers and objects to memorials, gravesides and sites of atrocity, and to leave them there for others to witness, indicates the need to memorialise the dead with images, with stories, with details and specifics, precisely because the way in which the name provides only an empty shell of remembrance. Here, the construction of a unitary collective body out of a diversity of political histories and identities is made possible by gradually stripping away their social, their political and historical specificity until it dissolves into a transparent symbol of universal humanity. Now, one of the narratives that Glasnevin Trust were insistent upon with regards to the necrology wall was that of equality, that all victims, regardless of their political or social affiliation, were to be treated equally on this memorial. However, this was not the case, as the leaders of the 1916 Rising had individual plaques with their portraits, with their year of birth and their year of death inscribed on them. So here we see a narrative of martyrdom of the 1916 leaders that has persisted in commemorations of the Rising more or less from the beginning. It's also playing out here on the necrology wall. So not only were these leaders set apart by having their images present on the wall, but these images are still there. So these are the only names not to be erased or discontinued from the wall. So martyrdom insists on the continuous reverence of the same individuals, leaving limited space for new voices or other victims of conflict to receive public recognition for their life events through commemoration. The persistence in keeping the leaders of the 1916 Rising and their visual images on the necrology wall indicates a preference in commemorating nationalist martyrs rather than their opponents or other passive victims of the conflict. So despite Glasnevin Trust's insistence on the equal remembrance of all who died between 1916 and 1923, it was never uniform to begin with. So the wall is a visual symbol which has been strategically placed in a prime location within the cemetery. So it's near the main entrance, it's beside the museum, it's on the main tour route, and it's overlooking the most visited grave in the cemetery, that of Michael Collins. You can just see it in the background to the right-hand side of the image. So this isn't the first instance of Glasnevin Cemetery strategically erecting memorials to solidify its position as an appropriate place of commemoration for both domestic and international visitors. Glasnevin Trust erected several memorials during the Decade of Centenaries, including the Cross of Sacrifice in 2014 in memory of soldiers from Ireland who died in the World Wars, and a Celtic Cross Memorial in 2016 to commemorate Ireland's 1 million famine victims who died during the Great Hunger between 1845 and 1849. So while these memorials aim to be respectful of the memory of those they commemorate, their positioning within the cemetery grounds has no direct link to the deceased, and the prime location of the memorials within the main tour route in the cemetery is hardly a coincidence. Therefore, these memorials and the necrology wall constitute a territorial marker of Glasnevin Cemetery's position in the Decade of Centenaries. The strategic positioning of these memorials suggests that they have been carefully considered not entirely from a commemorative point of view, but also from a commercial one. The wall also conceals the overflow seating area around the cafe. It also conceals some service vehicles and some equipment. Therefore, the wall has a function beyond that of commemoration, because if it didn't, why is it still there? So it very much still serves a function within the cemetery and for the museum. So the blank wall that we now see, the blank granite wall, is now akin to a utility room door, keeping away the unsightly mechanics of the everyday aspects of the cemetery. So the necrology wall was ill-conceived and problematic from the outset, not to mention the spelling mistake which was made evident at the unveiling in April 2016 with the fada on the I instead of the E. And this caused disappointment among groups such as Connor na Gaeilge, who stated how the mistake illustrated a laziness towards the Irish language and a frustration as to why those involved didn't ensure that the Irish language was as accurate and correct as the English spelling on the wall. However, the controversy over the necrology wall was not only in the limitations of its designs, as I'm alluding to here. It was a struggle over the control and appropriation of history through representation and commemoration. The necrology wall made a series of assumptions about the collective memory of the revolutionary period. The way the wall was designed assumed the existence of a collective memory, implying that all groups in society had an agreed interpretation of this period and would want to interpret them in the same way. The ill-judged plans and the lack of consultation led to Glasnevin Trust stepping out of the Decade of Centenaries as they deemed timely for themselves. So what's needed is not a discontinuing of poorly designed memorials that aim to reconcile, but a careful and considered articulation of the past. We need to be aware of what remembering can and cannot do, and we also need to recognise that addressing our conflicted past is a long-term, a complex and a difficult task. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for keeping so admirably to time as well. I'm terribly impressed. I'm going to shamelessly abuse my position as chair of this session. I think you'd expect nothing else in the first instance. But before I do that, some of you have already identified the possibilities here of posing a question. Those of you joining online in the YouTube chat. So I'll take some questions from there too. And there are also, for those of us in the room, there are 2 microphones, one on either side of the seating area. So if you do want to pose a question or make a comment, And given that this is a workshop and that these are ideas that we're here to explore together, for once, comments are as welcome as questions. Brevity, nonetheless, being important in a way that I'm failing to do at the moment. But I've got a couple of questions. I've got one kind of overarching question, I guess, for the whole panel, and then a few kind of specific questions. And I guess I would be interested in each contributor's perspective on whether and in what ways our understanding of the politics of commemoration have changed over the course of the Decade of Centenaries. And this, I suppose, leads into my specific question, which is for Laura and Dom in the first instance, which is particularly to you, Dom. You've been saying this stuff since the beginning, right? Since the outset of this thing we call the Decade of Centenaries. And I just wonder whether you can identify it having had an impact on, on how the thing has unfolded, and to reflect on where that has been the case and where it hasn't. And I think this, as I say, speaks to both of your contributions, Laura and Dom, is that in a sense what we're saying is not new, right, here today, and it has been unnew since at least 2012. But I'm curious as to where it has had an impact on the nature of the Decade of Centenaries. Owen, I'm interested in how the discourse of maturity and the representation of Ireland as, sure, where else would you get it, the best country in the world, etc., impact, how does that interact with the role and place of the North in Irish politics, and how is that reflected in debates and discourses around quote unquote maturity? And Siobhan, I'm interested in the interaction between the necrology wall and this conception of a mature approach to commemoration. That was very much the language that the necrology wall project was couched in. But at the end of the Decade of Centenaries, we can query, I think, we can ask questions about the nature of that undertaking, and what kind of questions can we ask that are framed by this idea or challenging this idea of maturity. So we'll go in the order that people have spoken, and if there are any reflections on each other's presentations, then those are also very welcome. But we'll go to you, Laura, in the first place.
Great, thank you. Those are some great and very difficult to answer questions. So, I think what I find interesting in watching this decade as it's unfolded is that there's certain things that were obviously attempted to direct that sometimes have gone slightly according to plan, and sometimes they went completely off, script. And I think that's interesting in terms of the lack of inevitability of some of it. It looked like we kind of knew where some things were going to go, but the political context changed things a lot. And I think also, as you mentioned, the kind of fear of the rise of Sinn Féin has kind of controlled a lot of the discourse, particularly around the Easter Rising, but seems to have created quite a big backlash. There's a lot of other things going on, obviously, not just about commemoration, but I think it's been interesting how that's not been as easy to control as it looked from kind of different type of establishment figures. In terms of having these conversations, I think, a lot of us have been saying the same thing for a long time. And it's been interesting in terms of, during the pandemic, that kind of pivot online, I think sometimes had a bit more impact than it usually would. We weren't always whistling into the wind. And sometimes I've written threads about commemoration that have got, hundreds and even thousands of retweets, which, usually wouldn't have got two people looking at them beforehand. So but I'm not sure how much any of that is actually kept on board by anyone. And lastly, just in terms of that issue about the role and the place of the North, I think it's kind of interesting, the discomfort with the North, and even looking at how different the commemorations of 1916 were in Belfast against Dublin, how different the narratives were, how more militaristic and how less slick they looked. And, obviously they're confined mainly to West Belfast when it's in Belfast, there's not really that attempt to be able to parade wherever. But also, the kind of the desire to not appear confrontational to Northern Unionists and not really caring too much about what Northern Nationalists think, I think was pretty interesting as well. So yeah, those are just some of my reflections that I came through. I could say a little more later, but about the issue of gender, I think sometimes was used as a slightly safe way of talking about new narratives, because women, I think, were included in slightly tokenistic ways in some ways, rather than really embedding them into these stories, where it was seen as this kind of new discovery, which I actually don't think really was the case. So I'm happy to hand over to Dawn.
Thanks, Laura.
I suppose I've got a negative and a positive here, I think. I don't think the sort of argument I'm trying to make, and in a way it's about the commonality of commemoration everywhere. All nations, all ethnic groups have this way of dealing with things. It's very, very common. And if you take on that idea and run with it, then actually the historical narrative becomes quite meaningless, interesting. It doesn't really matter what the story is. We know what we do. It doesn't matter which place you go to. They'll all do the same sort of thing, and it will come out in the same sort of place. And I think that's quite a powerful and interesting critique about nation. I don't think that has got everywhere, partly anywhere, partly because when you've got conflict like you do in the north, ironically, both sides agree on the nature of that conflict. They both agree on the nature of the nation. They disagree on where the outcome's going to be, but actually their model of the world is the same. All right, so they neither are going to break down each other. So I think, why should people care what anthropologists or others are saying, so I don't think that that's found a way in, except, and this is where does become interesting, in the forms of resistance that have been taken place around the world around things like Black Lives Matter, there has been a real question of how commemoration works, and that's where I think the fissures and the gaps have started to open up. And in the work of, wait for it folks, some historians and critiques and literary people are better at doing theory than historians as a rule. But if you look at the works like Priya Satia, critically looking at how historiography worked through the empire and how historians were the sort of handmaidens, although they were never maidens, were they? Of the politicians and putting that together, I do think that there's been a renewed critical focus, particularly around ideas of empire, and I think that is going to grow. And for me, that's a positive rethinking of what we do in history, how we understand it, what that discipline is.
A kind of final reckoning with empire and in the discipline of history. Yeah,
I think that's happening, and I think I should just say most of our disciplines carry some sort of Catholic type guilt with them, not least anthropology when it comes to empire and colonialism. But what I might suggest is I think anthropology went through the guilt of it and has tried to reconstruct itself probably since the 1980s in a way that I still think that we don't do around history. And I know there are friends and colleagues in history who would argue with me over that, but I still think
one of them's looking at you right now.
Well,
yeah.
I still think history as a discipline, in the way it's taught, hasn't fully appreciated the problems it has.
Mm-hmm. Thanks very much. Owen, if we can beam over to Galway.
Yeah, thanks for that, Jonathan. I think you asked how the discourse of maturity and the new, say, constitutional identity, how it relates to Northern Ireland.
Yes.
And I think I did mention that this idea of a socially liberal, progressive identity, it is defined in relation to the other. The other in question potentially being our nationalisms of the past, as well as illiberalisms abroad. The populism in particular on the continent and in Brexit Britain, but potentially as well, the other here can be Northern Ireland itself, and you see traces of that in establishment discourse, for the want of a better term. Particularly, you still see references to tribalism and the alleged tribalism or backwardness or illiberalism, say, of Northern Ireland society and Northern Ireland politics. That's certainly a commonplace trope, I guess, in discourses about Northern Ireland in the Republic. And where I see that potentially becoming relevant is on the southern side of the border in relation to any potential reunification process, any constituent process, where you have potential, say, political negotiation about constitutional identity and constitutional structure in a putative new state. Interestingly, the concept of constitutional identity is very amorphous. It can mean different things in different contexts. In constitutional law, where identity becomes very often relevant is as a defense mechanism towards constitutional change. So very often, constitutional identity, formally speaking, in constitutional law refers to the immutable core of a constitution that can't be changed by any process whatsoever. So the German basic law, for example, has certain immutable features that can't be revised. The Indian constitution has basic structure conjured up by the Supreme Court. There are lots of different examples of that. There's no formal concept in Ireland of an immutable core of constitutional identity incapable of being changed. But at the less formal, at the discursive register, if there is, say, an identitarian aspect to constitutionalism in this state, maybe this is where the analysis of maturity and progressivism becomes relevant. It's in that potential process, the constituent process for reunification.
Fantastic. Thanks, Owen. And to pick up on this idea of maturity and its expression in patterns of memorialisation and commemoration.
Yeah, my brain is going 90 here.
Yeah.
And just this idea of the necrology wall as a case study and trying to bring out that maturity and this forced idea of reconciliation. Putting names on a wall isn't enough. What's required is deeper engagement with the past and also with the present as well, but with those individuals on the wall. Glasnevin Trust wanted to present this narrative of maturity, and they thought it would be enough by just putting those names on the wall. I think as an overall, as we come towards the end of the Decade of Centenaries, I'm terribly disappointed. I had, I suppose, a naive and optimistic outlook of it. I come to this also as someone who was trying to conclude their PhD thesis on commemoration the week that the RIC commemorations controversy came about. But I do remember, even from the outset, there was a constant, I suppose, fear about the second half of it. And from speaking to historians and those working in the heritage and cultural industries, there was so much pomp and celebration around, as usual, the 1916 Rising. And when I was asking people that were involved in the commemorations, what's going to happen for the second half, like what's the plan? And most of them said, I'll be on career break by then. I was, overall, it was a terribly disappointing decade for me.
Sorry to hear it. I had a full head of hair at the beginning of the decade. I was just watching a couple of questions come in on the chat, but I'm keen to take any comments or questions that we may have in the room before I move on to those. Yes, Donald, if you want to just approach one of the mics.
Okay, does that work?
It's just so everyone can hear you online, that's all, yeah.
So thanks everyone, that was really, really fantastic and really thought-provoking. So I just have a couple of questions and comments. So the first thing I'll say about Dom's comments about historians is I broadly agree with what you're saying, but I would say that we should be careful of folding historians into one category, especially a kind of a Eurocentric category, because I think those things that you're talking about, people in history departments in Africa and Asia that we don't read because of the Global Academy structure, have been talking about these things long before they became fashionable in the global north. So I had a question for the panelists in general, but probably relating to Owen's presentation, which is the connection between this concept of maturity and then the concept of comfort. So uncomfortable discussions. And one of the things I've seen throughout the Decade of Centenaries, but also around discussions pertaining to Black Lives Matter as a kind of a brand that has been deployed in corporate contexts in universities, or conversations about colonialism and its legacies, is this idea of uncomfortable discussions, when quite often those discussions are between, you know, two white scholars, you know, middle-class scholars, people like me, in nice, salubrious corporate settings like this. What's uncomfortable about that? And then there's also the sense of this, just the uncomfortable is for our audience, but not for us. And I think that's been something I've seen a lot in the Decade of Centenaries, that let's have an uncomfortable discussion in which we tell the public that they're wrong, but we're completely comfortable in the discussion.
Yeah.
So how does that relate to maturity? And then on the the necrology wall, something I find really fascinating about that is that the constant evocation of the monument in Notre-Dame de Lorette in France is this inspiration. And what to me seems interesting is that that's a monument about an interstate conflict between, you know, two states or several states that, yes, they were engaged in a kind of a global conflict against each other, but they recognized each other's existence and they recognized their sovereignty prior to the conflict. Whereas whether the people in Ireland like this or not, the war in Ireland was a counterinsurgency versus an insurgency against a foreign rule and a counterinsurgency. And what does that tell us? Like, what is the difference between those two types of conflicts? Why do we not see similar monuments in other, say, in my view, colonial contexts where there have been insurgencies and counterinsurgencies? My view is that there is this attempt to reinvent the War of Independence, the revolutionary period in Ireland, as an interstate conflict that is tied to a broader effort to fold Ireland into a so-called European norm. But I'd love to hear what all of you think. Thank you.
Thanks, Donal. Will we go in reverse order this time? And if there are answers to those questions, starting with yourself, Siobhan, if that's not putting you under too much.
No, not at all. That was a great question and great observations around those of us in the room and virtually in the room as well, and that question of discomfort as well. To me, like, I must say as well that the necrology wall isn't the first instance during the Decade of Centenaries that we've had the same names within the same space. It happened as well in the National Museum's Proclaiming a Republic exhibition. They labelled it as the Dead of Easter Week, and they also faced criticism for having the British dead alongside the civilian dead of Dublin or of Ireland or whatever. So the necrology wall isn't entirely unique in its design, as you alluded to, the one in France, and not forgetting the Vietnam wall as well, which has, I think, around 58,000 names as well. So it's definitely not an entirely unique case study, but it is a very rich and complex one. And when I started writing this paper, I was thinking, oh, where do I start? And then once I got into it, it was like, where am I going to finish? Where is it going to end? But yeah, no. So thanks for also we need to be aware of the global context as well. So bringing in perhaps something that I should have done in the paper as well is to bring in those French and the case studies in the US as well.
Thanks, Siobhan. Owen, some specific questions for you as well.
Yeah, thanks for the question, and I think my response is going to be a case of thinking out loud on my feet. I'm not so sure. In terms of the discomfort or uncomfortable conversations, I think it's interesting that the discourse of maturity does make an effort at connecting with something that's supposed to be uncomfortable. In particular, when I made the argument that maturity was framed as it was supposed to be about interpretive pluralism and accepting critical views of the rising itself and critical views of the past, I think what that is supposed to refer to is people hearing out anti-nationalist or, say, skeptical views of revolutionary violence
and that's framed as something which was previously taboo or uncomfortable, and that's supposed to be what we are now confronting with our new maturity. That is I think the element of discomfort that the maturity discourse explicitly embraces. But then certainly, like, this is something I'm actually struggling with, and I'd like people's insights on generally, whether here or afterwards. What I'm struggling with is this problematization of an internalization by citizens or people of the revolutionary violence, which is supposed to be the corresponding immaturity. So the mature discourse, the mature commemorator or citizen externalizes and detaches themselves from the constituent violence itself, whereas immaturity involves some internalization or embrace of the revolutionary cause. And I think that is stigmatized in a sense, or it's rejected because it's potentially, it's unnuanced, it's unsophisticated, it's simplistic, it's nationalistic. In one sense, I wonder, is it felt as embarrassing, a kind of innocence, lacking in irony even. So I'm interested in what anyone else thinks about this issue of the stigmatization of the internalization of the cause itself.
That's really interesting. I think, from my perspective, that discourses about maturity also imply or seek to enforce particular positions vis-a-vis unionism as well. So there are questions about your approach to and the reconstruction of the other in these discourses about maturity as well, which I think are also at stake, but to be discussed. And finally, we'll go to Dom in terms of...
Very briefly, Dom,
yeah.
your point about the other voices that we miss and the other critiques, not in the global north, as it were, is absolutely taken. You're absolutely right on that. I'd just say on trying to do the critique of history, it's very difficult because I'm clearly I don't want to be seen as someone who's just damning history or historians. All right. What I want, but what we're discussing here is not history. What we're discussing is commemoration, and that I think is the point. We're discussing commemoration, and what I'm saying is that when the historian engages with commemoration, they're engaging with a very particular sort of space. And you can't do that without a critical analysis of what that space is. And I think that's the core. And the trouble is, the public arena doesn't allow for that critical analysis because it doesn't want to hear it. Because if you do that critical analysis, the commemorative practice starts to get dismantled. What's the title of our thing? Deconstructed.
Yeah. Yeah, the nature of that space is then called into question.
Yes.
Yeah. That's really interesting. And I guess without saying, I think that I agree. Yeah. And we've talked as well about the critical tools that are taught or indeed not taught to pass those kinds of ideas as well. And Laura, if you have any reflections on those questions.
Yeah, so I suppose the discussion about the uncomfortableness, I find this kind of interesting, particularly in terms of how we interpret the past and interpret commemoration, particularly from museums and heritage points of view, that often there's like this fear of the public not being able to deal with difficult things or uncomfortable things. But my own experience of working with subjects which are considered uncomfortable is that they are able and willing and interested in having discussions that are not just reaffirming what people already know. And I think there's often a slight condescension that the general public just can't deal with things that are what is assumed outside their comfort zone, when actually it's probably we're not very good at thinking about how to present that stuff in a way that is not flattening it or making it divisive or just kind of trying to pretend things aren't there because they're uncomfortable for us to talk about. So I think sometimes we need to be a little more a bit more willing to kind of push those envelopes a little bit, and a bit more willing to have what we think are uncomfortable conversations, because actually the public are kind of open to them.
Yeah, I would agree. And there's something interesting as well in the discourse around discomfort, in that many of the ideas I think that have been dominant during the Decade of Centenaries have been dominant in public discourse and in political discourse in Ireland for a long time, actually. I'm not sure there's always that much left that's uncomfortable about them, and that's sort of struck me for the duration. We've got a couple of questions on the chat that are, I think, quite specific for specific contributors. One is from Stephen Miller, who's being awkward, as you might imagine, Dom, asking about ideology and the poppy, and that he's suggesting that perhaps some people in the audience did know that the poppy was or is political, but couldn't voice that.
And in a way, that was my point. The sacred space is so strong, it's so difficult, that yes, I mean, Stephen's right, as he is most of the time.
Hi, Stephen.
Yes, I think he gets the whiskey you want right a lot of the time, actually. But no, he's absolutely right. I think that's what I'm saying about the power of that space. That if you're seeing that, I mean, I've been there. I mean, I've gone to conferences around November in Northern Ireland with a poppy in my jacket, just in case it became so uncomfortable that I might need to use it, because it really can be a difficult space. And we all know that suggesting, I mean, those of us who live in Northern Ireland know there is the annual discussion of why a certain presenter on TV is not wearing a poppy. There is a lot of pressure on that. Stephen's exactly right. I'm sure there were people who felt otherwise in that audience, but even putting your hand up at that point is difficult.
Yeah. And a question from Linda Connolly as well, which I think is specifically addressed really to Owen, which is about the kinds of political and constitutional changes that are expressed in those referendum results that you've been talking to. And she asks, were these referendums not embedded and embodied political outcomes, the product of social movements, not just symptomatic of more generic identity shifts?
Thanks, Linda. Yeah, I mean, certainly, I mean, the repeal referendum in particular was the product of grassroots activism. There's no doubt about that. That makes it relatively unusual in terms of Irish referendums. It's a very elite orchestrated constitutional mechanism. The referendum. It's a tightly gate-kept thing. So, for example, even where we have deliberative mechanisms, deliberative processes like the Citizens' Assembly or before the Constitutional Convention, the Constitutional Convention in particular made certain recommendations about socioeconomic rights, or referendums on socioeconomic rights that were never accepted by the then government. So the inclusion of, I suppose, the inclusion of ordinary people in the decision to even hold referendums, the decision to initiate the formal constitutional amendment process is highly selective. So it can both be true. I think both things are quite true, that you do have certain referendums and constitutional amendments that are the products of grassroots activism, while it's equally being true that overall the landscape of constitutional amendment is a highly gate-kept and elite orchestrated landscape, if you like. And certainly the narration of identity change around these liberalising referendums is, I think, an elite discourse, which isn't to say, of course, that these amendments don't have a lot of merit. Of course, many of them, I voted yes for all 5 of them, but for what it's worth. But it doesn't, it's not a criticism of the amendments themselves, but more of their use as a narration of shifting national identity.
Thanks, Owen. Are there any further questions from the in the room audience? Yes. Do you want to approach one of the microphones? And we'll take these then as our last questions for this session, and then we'll move to our tea break.
Sean Garland, University, PhD student. First of all, I'd like to thank you all for an extremely interesting, detailed and thorough run through of all the issues, influences and factors that are at play here with Commemoration. I'm a wannabe historian, so I take on board all the comments that have been made in relation to the two disciplines and so on, particularly with anthropology and Dom's comments on those. They're constructive and very insightful. But the point I wanted to come to, as somebody who lives in the north and comes from a particular background in the north, I wanted to just ask is, when we frame this discussion and we talk about it, the extent to which the commemoration that's attempted in Ireland, whether it's north or south, is inhibited and limited indeed because of the fact that the constitutional question is still alive. The issues that we're seeking to commemorate are still potentially live and still potentially being outworked, and how that is different in an Irish context, north and south, to what you would see, for example, in commemoration of the Second World War in Europe, or the First World War in Britain, or the American Civil War in the United States. To what extent does that cause this situation where we're saying, I was struck by what Laura said, for example, you can talk about hunger strikers, Thomas Ashe, but when you start to edge closer to the hunger strikes of 80, 81, you start to get into territory that's a bit, to be avoided. And so, and the same, the Irish state's attitude to ensuring that they're seen as liberal and as Owen said, mature, that they're taking this mature attitude to a rising and to the violence that was used in that rising to achieve a certain goal, and that doesn't cause offence to either our British neighbours or our Northern Unionist fellow citizens. And yet at the same time, the Northern Nationalist who looks at those events and views them in a completely different way, as still an active project and an active thing that has to happen. And that this touches, I think it was yourself maybe, but somebody said about the rise of Sinn Féin, and it touches on all of that. And to what extent that spatial difference between what's commemorated in the north and commemorated in the south, whether it's, and actually it's true as well for the Unionist community too, because the way in which they commemorate the Somme or sense of Britishness, and what the British people themselves, how they actually view that. So to what extent, I suppose, to wrap it all up in one bundle is, and I apologise if I'm dumbing this down a little bit, so I do apologise for that, but it's just this idea, to what extent in Ireland do we have particular circumstances when it comes to commemoration because of this ongoing, for some, an ongoing constitutional and revolutionary project which is unfinished business, and that marks it out as different to what you have, as I say, in the continent or in Europe or throughout the world. Thank you.
Thanks very much. One thing that strikes me in response, I'm not really supposed to be doing this, am I? I'm supposed to be showing video, is that all nations, right, are works in progress, and they're all contested. And I suppose that's an immediate reflection, is that's one of the critical things that emerges, I think. But I'm going to ask each of our speakers to respond to that final question. I'm going to ask them to do so quite briefly so that we can move into our break at 11:50 in order to reconvene at just after 12 o'clock. But we'll go in the order that people spoke, and we'll ask Laura, first of all, to offer some final reflections drawing on that question.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I thought it was really well put. I think this is one of the things that heritage scholars have talked about. Whenever the past is still overtly political, then it is different from the idea that, there's a general consensus that some pasts are more settled than others. And it's, fairly obvious through the decade of commemorations that the live nature of the political, nature of that past is really, really alive. So, and became more alive, which I think made things even more difficult. Like as Siobhan said, there was a fear already at around 2016 that the end of the decade was going to be harder than the earlier parts. But with Brexit, I think that made that even harder, and particularly how it unravelled since that. It hasn't been in any way a kind of smooth process, so it's been incredibly unsettling. And I think there's an interesting aspect as well about the North, and how much it's been othered from, the national narratives of both the British and Irish states, in terms of an almost willful ignorance about how complex these things are. And I think that's been an ongoing thing for quite a long time, the unexplainable North narrative, that, these kind of crazy people who just don't seem to be able to stop conflicting with each other, seems to have been an ongoing kind of discussion, and particularly every time there's something newsworthy in the North, how there's this rediscovery of these things all over and over again, as if it hasn't been discussed 100 times before. So I think there's kind of an interesting aspect of not wanting to understand the North because you don't really want to unravel the political nature of it. So I'll just end there. Thanks.
Dom.
No, just yes, I think is the simplest answer. Commemoration is always constitutive of the present that it is in, and even the historians, Margaret speaking later, who are looking at commemoration in the past are analysing it in the main constitutive of that present the past is in. If you're looking at it at 1966, the commemoration is usually bluntly telling you more about 1966 than it is telling you about 1916. And that sort of historical work, I think, is really important. However, what becomes interesting is when you begin to see breaks and fissures taking place, which just returns us to that Black Lives Matter moment, to that empire moment. And are we seeing, particularly in Britishness, some real openings taking place? And then we ask ourselves not about the past, but we ask ourselves about the present and what is taking place in British society at the moment, which is beginning to wrench that, hegemonic position apart.
Thanks, Dom. Owen.
Yeah, thanks. Really interesting question. I don't have an awful lot to add to the others in relation to what I already said, but about Northern Ireland and I guess the politics of commemorating violence. Obviously, as others have said, all commemoration is shaped by contemporary politics to some extent, and of course you have the question both of politics in this state in terms of the electoral rise of Sinn Féin and the politics of Northern Ireland itself. Well, what I would say is that the idea of maturity as involving the externalization of constituent violence probably has precedence, I think, in the reaction of the state in the south towards the campaign of the Provisional IRA and certain imperatives which emerged around commemorating violence or responding to the memory of violence in that specific light. And in particular, how that shaped the management, if you like, of discourse around violence in Southern politics. So I think it's, to some extent, the idea of maturity as requiring an externalization of constituent violence might be interpreted, I don't know, as a legacy of that particular phenomenon.
I certainly think so, for what it's worth. And thank you, Owen and Siobhan. The final word is yours.
Well, I think unfinished business is the perfect way to sum it all up. As I said, unfinished business, very much to do with the political landscape and the commemorative one. And I just wanted to pick up briefly on something that Owen touched on earlier that kind of stuck with me, and this idea of like the branding of Ireland and of the nation, and that's very much played out through how the Decade of Centenaries has played out as well. But the quote that he had from Enda Kenny, that Ireland is the greatest little place to do business in, like a notion like that is totally useless when it's coming from a political leader of the country that he's talking about. That's something maybe I'll pick up on another time, how this branding of Ireland has been like a conscious part of how we commemorate the founding of the Free State as well. So a lot to think about.
Thanks very much to all of our speakers on this first panel, exploring commemoration as a set of embodied practices and discourses. How over the course of the Decade of Centenaries those have been framed by this conception of maturity and debates about and arguments about maturity, and how that seeks to construct particular ideas about the political community, and the idea of kind of reconciliation. And I'm reminded, because she's just joined us in the room, that a really important work that has framed a lot of my thinking more recently around this stuff, the idea that the past can't heal us. Is essentially important, I think, to the discussions that we're going to have over the duration of the day. So it's 5 to 12 now. We'll reconvene at 10 past 12 if that's okay, Alan. Yep. Yeah. And then that will take us through then till about kind of 1:15, 20 past 1, and we'll break for lunch then. So thanks very much, and we'll reconvene then in 15 minutes. Thanks.